Why use 24 frames a second? It can potentially offer a more film-like appearance. It's certainly easier for a computer to manage, and more data bits are available, so potentially it offers a higher quality of picture. But there is more likelihood of jitter, that sort of movement in the video where things jitter around. And not forgetting, do I really want my videos to take on a more serious cinematic kind of look, especially in home movies? And not forgetting that movement within a video can look quite different in 24 frames per second in comparison to something like 50 or 60. Recently, I've been playing around with frame rates, and I found as long as you take a little more care in the way that you shoot, you can get great results, especially if you make sure that the camera is secure. So I've got the Action 4 at the moment locked off on a tripod. I'm using 24 frames a second at a 50th of a second shutter, and to make up for the too much light going in that lens, I put a filter on the front as well. A slow frame rate can give the video a slightly more take me serious appearance. That can be really useful for some types of video, especially if you combine a slow shutter with a widescreen effect as well. One of the biggest problems though with the slow shutter speed is that if you want to take your camera off a tripod and handhold it, blurriness, handshake can become a problem, but also the stabilization in the camera. So on those occasions, it might be better to actually break the 180-degree shutter rule. For this video, I'm following the conventions of the 180-degree shutter rule. I'm using 24 frames a second and a 50th of a second on the shutter. So that's 180 rule, 24 times 2 is 48, so 50 is the closest. And I've got stabilization switched on. So if there are any weird artifacts and things going on in the background, it's probably the result of the slow shutter speed and the stabilization, because the stabilization needs a high shutter speed. Now I'm breaking the 180-degree shutter rule, and I'm using whatever it wants to use. In actual fact, it's roughly about 1/800th of a second at 24 frames a second. And you might see that the background is a little bit more stable now than it was before, with less glitches going on, because we're getting sharp pictures, and that allows the stabilization to work properly. Even if I run now, it's probably going to be okay. So going for a quick run, and hopefully everything's all right. And that's at 24 frames a second. So to finish, 24 frames per second is a useful thing to use if you want to add a little bit more gravitas to your videos, to make them look a bit more serious. It's a very useful thing to use. It's better if you slow the shutter speed down and put the camera onto some kind of support. That eliminates handshake from your video, and also it stops you having these funny artifacts from any camera stabilization that you might be using. Turn the stabilization off and leave it on a tripod, and 24 frames per second looks great, absolutely brilliant. Once you take that camera off though, you're going to get into troubles because you start to see jitter. And that's when you really do need to just forget the rules, forget the 180 shutter rule, and just use a fast shutter speed in order to be able to use the stabilization in the camera. That gets rid of an awful lot of jitter. And I'd rather have a stable video than one that's jaggedy and jumping around all over the place. There is one other issue as well. Try to avoid pans if you can. Panning is when you move the camera left to right or right to left slowly. Even on a tripod, if you go just a fraction too fast, it introduces judder in the way that the picture moves across the screen. So you need to be very careful with panning. In fact, actually, I avoid panning at 24 frames per second if I can. What I do is I take a still shot, move the camera, still shot, move the camera, still shot, and I basically fade each shot into the other to avoid the movement of the camera going left and right or up and down. If you avoid that, then you don't really point out the fact that you've got judder or jitter going on in the background there. So, ideally on a tripod, slow shutter speed, wide open lens gives you that lovely serious feel. You can still use 24 frames per second on an action cam, but the shutter has to go up, which to some extent loses that cinematic film type look, because it's a lot sharper looking as well, because the picture's more crisp. But it does look good. So this video has been brought to you in 24 frames a second, hopefully giving it a more authoritative authoritative feel. Got it. Cheers for now.